Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Becca Pincus, Director of the Polar Institute, and we are delighted to be partnering with Norway's Center for the Ocean and Arctic for today's event. The Wilson Center is the leading nonpartisan think tank for tackling global issues through scholarship and open dialogue. As such, the Center for the Ocean and Arctic is an ideal partner. The COA was appointed by the Norwegian government to compile, analyze, and communicate knowledge about the blue economy through neutrality, holistic thinking, and cooperation. The COA's mission is to create a solid knowledge base for decision makers and to support open social discourse. Today, we partner on an important and timely event, the Arctic Ocean and climate change in a time of tension. I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador of Norway to the United States, Anniken Krutnes. Ambassador.
Thank you, Rebecca. Dear friends of the Arctic, thank you to the Polar Institute of Wilson Center and to Norwegian Center for the Ocean and the Arctic for organizing this event today. Both institutions care deeply about the Arctic and about our oceans, as do our two nations, Norway and the US. So I'm so pleased that you are making this event, and it's very timely. And thank you for letting me come with a few remarks at the opening of this event. Once upon a time, I used to be Norway's Arctic ambassador, and I held a lot of speeches about the Arctic. And I always told more or less the same story. The Arctic is a fantastic region. It is peaceful. It's prosperous, rich in resources, predictable and stable. And we want it to stay like that. And that is the question now. Are we able to keep the Arctic region that way? Prosperous, predictable, stable. We also used to say that there were, of course, many reasons that the Arctic functioned as well as it did. But three main reasons were that there was respect for international law in the Arctic. There was international cooperation in the Arctic. And there was responsible management of the resources in the Arctic. Do we still have this? Let's start. Let's hold on to what we've got. What about the legal aspects in the Arctic? Yes, the Arctic is still governed by international law. And it is still respected in the Arctic. The problem is the trust, because the biggest Arctic nation has flagrantly breached international law in Ukraine. The meaningless, the brutal aggression that Putin's regime has done to Ukraine has, of course, done something with the trust in the Arctic. But the law is still there. There's no legal vacuum in the Arctic. UNCLOS gives us the rules of the play, limits for territorial waters, for economic zones, for continental shelf. We know who owns the resources. Polar Code of IMO says something about what you have to do with your ship if you want to be in Arctic waters. The arrangements made under the auspices of the Arctic Council on oil spill preparedness, on search and rescue, and not least on science cooperation. And of course, the fisheries agreement for the Central Arctic Oceans. All this is international law that still is valid in the Arctic. On the cooperation side, things have become a bit more difficult, to say it mildly. The activities of the Arctic Council was suspended last year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And as we've always said, the Arctic Council is the most important forum for cooperation in the Arctic. So from Norway's side, we are serious in making the Arctic Council survive this crisis. Norway is scheduled to take over the chairship for the Arctic Council in May this year, and our first priority is the orderly transition from a Russian chairship to a Norwegian chairship. Because we believe that the Arctic Council needs to continue to exist. And as some of you know, the main work in the Arctic Council is done in the working groups, and there is a lot of important scientific work being done in the working groups. Some of this has actually picked up carefully, but without the participation of Russia. So we will have to see, after we take over, how we can continue carefully to have activities in the Arctic Council. But first, we will have to take over the chairship. The third element I would mention is the responsible management of resources. That is something we all strive to do. And of course, in order to do that, we need science. We base our management decisions on best available information. We need the science, we need the research, because that's what we base our decisions on. And that is why I'm so much looking forward to this seminar today, because we will discuss how we can cooperate on research and science in the Arctic, for the Arctic and for the oceans. So I'm looking forward to a very fruitful and successful seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Krutnes, for those insightful framing remarks. I am honored now to introduce our keynote speaker, Representative Shelley Pingree from the state of Maine's 1st District. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the Wilson Center and the Center on the Ocean and Arctic for hosting this event. I'm really pleased to participate and to be with all of you. Thank you, Ambassador Krutnes, for joining us and being a part of this and helping to sponsor this. I didn't get a chance to mention to you earlier that I'm actually a Minnesotan whose grandfather came from Norway in the late 1800s. So I'm one of those many Minnesotan Americans who thinks they're more Norwegian than the Norwegians who come to visit us in Minnesota. But I'm a Mainer now, but anyway, it's wonderful to be in your presence. Dr. Sfrega, congratulations on your nomination, Ambassador. That's such a critically important moment in time, and we're looking forward to your confirmation. And Dr. Lubchenko, we got a chance to work with each other when you were at NOAA. Such a wonderful job that you did there and such a critically important. So thank you everyone who's joining virtually, and I'm really pleased to be a part of this. Normally when we think about members of Congress who come to participate in Arctic-related activities, of course we think of our friends from Alaska, of which we don't have enough in Congress, but and I don't have a lot of congressional colleagues who actually are focused on the issues related to the Arctic, but we do in Maine, and I am from Maine. Unlike Alaska, of course, we're not in the Arctic Circle, but with all the changes in the summer ice, both the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route changing, Portland, Maine is the first port on the East Coast. So we think of ourselves as very engaged, but we're engaged in a lot of other ways. And I just wanted to say a little bit about my own life. I am very connected to the ocean. So in spite of the fact that I was born in Minnesota, since I was a teenager, I've lived on an island 12 miles off the coast of Maine. We're reached only by a ferry. We have a population of 417 people. So yesterday when I started my trip to DC, I boarded a ferry at 7:15 in the morning. It was 19 degrees, blowing 25 knots out of the north-northwest, and all the passengers walking on were greeting each other saying, "Wait, isn't this the first day of spring? Why is it so cold?" But we live in a fishing town. We're connected only by the ferry. And talking about the weather, and the weather plays a huge role in our daily lives, and it's our constant source, of course, of conversation. This weekend while I was home, I stopped into a little gathering that hosted by some of our high school students. We have the smallest high school in the state, about 3 to 5 students in our graduating classes. I really do mean small. And they are actually having, a group of them are having a course studying the blue economy. Where I live, we just call it how people make a living, but that's what it is. They've been studying the changes in our traditional fisheries and the challenges and economic opportunities that are arising from our changing climate, and our fishing, which is our way of life. Our students recently attended the state's Fishermen's Forum, And next month, they will go to Nova Scotia, riding on yet another ferry in May to compare some of the Canadian challenges and opportunities there. But at the event, they served us this menu they'd cooked up of unusual recipes from underdeveloped species. So we ate crunchy roasted bladder wrack seaweed, which we normally don't pick up on the coast, but it was quite good. Popcorn that was seasoned by sea truffle, pickled green crabs, which are a terrible invasive species and a good way to use them up, and a little bit of clam spaghetti and some raw oysters. We like to think of ourselves as sort of Arctic light. We're still facing many of the same challenges. We've been dealing with the drama of sea level rise in some of our most recent storms. On Christmas Eve Day, we had a devastating storm that reminded all of us in my community and many other coastal communities that this is moving faster than we thought. The Gulf of Maine is warming at a rate 99% faster than all the rest of the world, faster than 99% of the other world oceans. So it's already having an impact on our traditional fisheries. Our shrimp fishing has disappeared. We think they've gone to Iceland or somewhere in Canada. Our scallops are closely monitored now, and of course, lobsters that are our pride and joy are already moving north, and we're greatly concerned about how this impact may speed up over time. The students in our class are studying one of my bills, the Coastal Communities Ocean Acidification Bill, which is a bill I'm doing with others to support coastal communities that are grappling with climate change-related ocean acidification, getting the federal and government involved with state and local experts. Now, our connections in Maine aren't just mine. They actually are historic and deep. As many of you know, Admiral Perry most famously laid claim to the discovery of the North Pole in 1909, following his expedition with Matthew Henson, the first African-American Arctic explorer, and a group of Inuit guides. So we think of ourselves as very much related to polar exploration. But long before that, the artifacts of red paint people have been discovered showing trade routes between Labrador and Maine. In fact, the farm that I live on is a significant archaeological dig site, and there are artifacts found there from 4,000 and 1,000 years ago, fish hooks made out of swordfish bone, species we don't even see anymore. Of course, cod was such an important part of New England in the 19th century, and our fishermen sailed into the Maritimes in the North Atlantic. But like a lot of states, Maine had sort of shifted its focus, thinking that we would build our new economy around call centers or high technologies. And it was only about 10 years ago, really, that we shifted our focus back. That was when IMSCIP, Iceland's oldest shipping company, opened in Maine. And now we have regular shipping that has opened our trade routes between Northern Europe and Scandinavia, and certainly to Iceland, and working out our trade direct to Greenland. This has greatly broadened our trade there. We did about $900 million worth of Maine exports in 2021, so it's changing rapidly. About the same time, in 2013, we opened the Maine North Atlantic Development Office. And since then, over 300 Mainers have traveled to Arctic markets. A delegation of 41 Mainers was at the 2022 Arctic Assembly. Those are people from business, government, academia. Our major museum just recently had an exhibit between Portland and Reykjavik, and we have regular exchanges with students and professors from Iceland, Greenland, and Maine colleges, working on everything from climate change and law to the hospitality industry, something our state knows very well. But just as we've reconnected in Maine, I feel like the United States and the federal level is starting to understand, at least within Congress, that we have to come to grips with how woefully far behind we are with having an appropriate presence in the Arctic. I don't have to tell anyone here, but often people just use the example of the icebreakers, the 55 icebreakers that belong to Russia, and the 5, if you're generous, that belong to the United States. That puts us at about the same level as China, who has 4. We all know what a dangerous time this is in terms of our relationships with Russia and China, and for security reasons, if nothing else, it necessitates a much stronger presence in the Arctic. With temperature rising in the Arctic at 3 times of the global average, we also know that the impacts aren't just felt in the Arctic, but across our entire planet. As I was mentioning, Arctic concerns aren't a priority of many members of Congress. And geographically, if you think about it, besides Alaska and Maine, everybody else is somewhere in the middle, and you don't really think about your connection to the north. But I do think when people see it, it can have an impact. So last year, I was lucky enough to be on an Aspen Institute trip where about 15 or a little more congresspeople came to Iceland and had a wonderful visit looking at renewable energy, carbon capture, learn more about our security interests and our long relationship, climate change's impact on glaciers, fisheries, and so much more. Since we've come back from that trip, we've been able to gain more bipartisan support for the Iceland caucus, and I hope next week we'll have myself and Representative Murphy, the Republican, announcing as co-chairs that we're trying to expand the Iceland caucus, doing so with a meeting of other colleagues who have been to Iceland, and I'm planning to reintroduce the Iceland Act, which would add Iceland to the list of nations eligible for investment and trade in the United States. All of those things are greatly helped when our colleagues are able to visit or attend a meeting or get a better understanding firsthand of how that is. Many of you are working closely with the administration, so I won't go into how important it is that the Biden administration reactivated the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, appointed new leadership in 21. We'll soon have an Arctic ambassador. In my own role, I'm the Interior Appropriations Ranking Member, and in 2023, we played our part by increasing the funding at USGS, which plays an important role in scientific research, to $18.9 million. Our 4 priority areas for scientific research are community resilience and health, advancing scientific understanding of Arctic systems and interactions, creating more sustainable economies and livelihoods, improving risk management and hazard mitigation. Clearly, we can do so much more, but I'm really proud to have that role to play a part in advancing our scientific research. There's so much more I could discuss, and there are others who are better poised to do that. But just, again, to mention so many of our challenges, dealing with the future issues around mining and drilling and renewable resources, shipping and Russia's current dominance, climate change, yesterday's IPCC report reminding us once again the gruesome situation that we're already in and understanding the huge impact of the polar region, the importance of us keeping up our commitment to the Paris Accord and the work that we're already doing through the IRA, through our infrastructure, making sure we continue to be and advance ourselves as a world leader in promoting climate change, management of the fisheries and the tremendous changes that will be happening there, having a security strategy that clearly has the Arctic as an important focus, and making sure we get more of those icebreakers built and improve our infrastructure. So I'm very pleased to be able to participate with all of you in this conversation. Look forward to continuing to work with you and pushing the United States to continue to do more. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Pingree, for those terrific remarks. I can never complain about a commute to work again after hearing about that ferry ride. Thank you for that address. That was terrific. I'd like to now call our first panel up to the stage. We will have Evan Bloom, our senior fellow at the Polar Institute, moderating panel 1. Representative Pingree has agreed to join us for the first panel. Dr. Michael Sfraga, the chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, will be joining us, and Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who is Deputy Director for Climate and the Environment in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. Please, thank you.
So thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here for our first panel of the morning is going to focus on Arctic Ocean governance and the U.S. government, and we have a terrific group of panelists here to talk about some of the key issues here. So the next panel is going to focus on science and research. But here we can focus on an array of ocean governance issues, and there are, of course, a lot of them, touching on international cooperation, blue economy, trade, marine conservation, and many other issues. And the background, of course, are the implications of the Ukraine conflict. So. We have already heard from Ambassador Krutnes that there is a strong basis for governance in the Arctic and in the Arctic Ocean, and that's certainly the case. On the cooperation side, as she's suggested, things are a little bit more challenging these days. So we have to work through the implications of all of that. And so for our panelists, we can, of course, explore not just executive branch views on these issues, but also those of Congress. So it's a good opportunity to focus on these issues. So first, what I'd like to do is ask for some opening remarks from our three panelists. And so, Dr. Luchenko, could I begin with you?
Thank you, Evan. Hello, everyone. Madam's Ambassador, what a delightful thing to say. And Congresswoman Pingree, really wonderful to be here. Colleagues, dear friends, I was inspired by some of the opening remarks and want to just share with you my gratitude for the Wilson Center, but also the Norway Center for Ocean and the Arctic for bringing us together here today. As an American who is a descendant of Norwegians, like Congresswoman Pingree, my grandfather also emigrated to, in this case, North Dakota and then Minnesota, so we have some common features there. It's always a treat to be partnering with Norwegian colleagues. And as a American who is also a descendant of Ukrainians, Lubchenko, as you might guess, is Ukrainian. The topics of the day, some of the challenges in the Arctic that are driven by political aspirations are also near and dear to my heart from a personal standpoint. When in 2007, 2008, and 2009, I had 4 different but extended opportunities to spend time in various parts of the Arctic, in Alaska, in Greenland, in Svalbard, spending time both on the land but also shipboard in multiple bodies of water in the Arctic, and really had an opportunity to see firsthand and meet and hear stories firsthand from the people of the region. The number of people that told similar stories across those broad geographies was really quite striking. And the importance of the long history of their presence in the Arctic region, the 4 million people that live in the Arctic, what they are experiencing, what they have experienced, what they have learned, coupled with the abundant natural resources and just stunning beauty of the Arctic, and the spirit of potential, of possibilities, but also of dramatic changes were just so vivid, so dramatic. I remember one time in Utqiagvik standing on the north shore and with a bunch of school kids who were standing there with their jaws just dropped because they were seeing for the first time in their lives big waves coming ashore because there was no more sea ice, and so the long fetch from Wrangel Island to the north coast of Alaska was open, and the waves were building up. And so for someone, I live in Oregon, and so both in Oregon or in Maine, great big huge waves crashing ashore would be no big deal. But for these school kids, this was something unprecedented. That was in 2008. And we had just seen in 2007 some of the lowest sea ice extent in the Arctic, and so those were obviously coupled. But seeing events like that, visiting Shishmaref, where at the time there were still buildings that were literally falling into the ocean because of sea level rise, talking to many of the Alaska natives that were wrestling with moving graves of ancestors on the North Slope Borough. So many of those stories really resonated, and I have just come to appreciate the dramatic changes that are underway and how important they are and how much they resonate. You know, we used to say, and I think it's still true, you know, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, and we certainly are seeing that with climate change. So that's just by way of context for how important, you know, my personal connections to the Arctic, having never actually lived there, but just feeling a special connection. In the Arctic, many of the issues that are important to us in the White House, and in particular in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, come together in the Arctic. It really is a place of convergence. And so whether we're talking about tackling climate change or supporting equity and environmental justice, elevating indigenous knowledge, conserving and restoring lands and waters, all of those issues are important to us, but they really come together in a very integrated fashion, a very dramatic fashion in the Arctic. So what I'd like to do is just share briefly a few of the things that we are working on that are relevant to, not exclusively, but relevant to what is happening in the Arctic. First of all, later today, President Biden will announce the U.S.'s first ever Ocean Climate Action Plan. And this is making a very simple point. There is no path to net zero without the ocean. Purely, simply. There is no path to a healthy and livable climate without the ocean. The ocean is really key to our ability to tackle climate change. And on top of the release yesterday of the synthesis report from the IPCC, which Representative Pingree has already mentioned, and the special report of a few years ago from the IPCC on the cryosphere and the ocean in the cryosphere, which is still absolutely relevant today. It just makes a point of how dramatic the changes are in the ocean, and that it is not just the ocean is suffering or is being impacted by climate change, but that the ocean is also a solution to climate change. And so that's, I think, a very important message, and we are pursuing that very aggressively. And that is not only through renewable energy from the ocean, offshore wind, but also decarbonizing shipping. And Norway and the United States have been leaders in issuing the Green Shipping Challenge, which has been, I think, a real call to action from many other nations who have joined and are helping focus on decarbonizing shipping. We're also talking about blue carbon ecosystems and the importance of protecting and expanding protections and conserving and restoring blue carbon ecosystems, the salt marshes, the mangroves, the seagrass beds. So that's one of the things that we are really focused on. And thanks to the very strong partnerships between the President and Congress. Thank you, Congresswoman Pingree, for all the work that you've done in leading support for the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law. We now have the resources to help achieve some of the very, very ambitious goals of this administration when it comes to tackling climate change. The other one that I would highlight for you, number 2, is our enthusiasm for the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. The U.S. joined in November of 2021. There are now 17 countries in the high-level panel, and it is a partnership to really focus on the importance of, or just the message that protecting effectively, producing sustainably, and prospering equitably go hand in hand. Thirdly, we have a strong focus on indigenous knowledge and elevating the importance of indigenous knowledge in federal decision-making. Federal agencies are bound to focus on evidence and science, and now they are instructed to pay attention to and to elevate as appropriate indigenous knowledge. And our partners from the Alaska Native tribes and peoples has been key in developing that policy. The fourth one I would note is simply that we have, I think, a model partnership that is developing around the Northern Bering Sea Climate Resilience Area with federal task force and a tribal advisory council working together on behalf of having the kind of protection and management that will support sustainable use of the Northern Bering Sea. And that is part of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, overseen by the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, which Ambassador Bolton, who is here with us today, for which he is the executive director. And that Arctic Executive Steering Committee is really bringing a whole of government approach to the Arctic and really understanding the importance of integration across agencies and offices and bringing together the tribes, the state, research institutions, private, nonprofit sector, to really meet the needs of Americans living in the Arctic and to advance U.S. interests throughout the circumpolar region. Part of what the Arctic Executive Steering Committee is doing is also implementing or creating the implementation plan for the national strategy for the Arctic region, which was led by the National Security Council, and which really provides a dynamic framework to guide U.S. policies and actions in the region for the coming decade. So those are 6 different things that we are working actively on that are integrated, that really come together in the Arctic. We realize that the geopolitical situation has really changed dramatically, particularly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. Russia's unprovoked war has really made it virtually impossible to cooperate with Russia on most issues, including in the Arctic. And therefore, what we are doing is really focusing our efforts to work with allies and with partners to address the many challenges that the Arctic focuses on. Our role within the Office of Science and Technology Policy is to bring the knowledge to bear on these issues and to work closely with partners not only across the U.S. government, but with others internationally. So that gives you a flavor for some of the things that we're working on, that we bring to the table, and we're just delighted to have this opportunity to connect with all of you today. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you so much, Jane. Mike, floor is yours.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Dr. Lubchenco and Congresswoman Pingree. Jane, you've just highlighted a couple of my notes, so I'm not going to go through them all, but I think what you have summed up here is that whether it's the Arctic Ocean or the Arctic or the other issues that we are all working on, that research plays a central role to inform our policy. So research-informed, data-driven policy development, not only for the President's announcement later today, but for the very work we're doing. And Congresswoman Pingree, we do in Alaska look at Maine as our other Arctic friend. So we are connected. But your story about 400 or so people living in a village with 3 or 4 high school students having to travel through ferries, you could just insert many places in our country, certainly in the Arctic, anywhere in the Arctic. And so we feel your celebration. We also feel your pain. we know the challenges, but it's clear through this discussion that there's a thread that our world is changing, and we need to act with a sense of urgency. And I think that we see that sense of urgency, Jane, in some of the things that you talked about. So maybe, Evan, what I will do is vector off a little bit and just talk a little bit about what we see coming out of our government and how it works with, and how we're working with our international friends for not just the Arctic Ocean, of course the Arctic Ocean, but the Arctic writ large. Dr. Lubchenco mentioned the Arctic Executive Steering Committee led by Ambassador Bolton. We're all involved in that interagency whole of government approach. That's not new, but it sure has been elevated by the work of those who are involved in it, and of course through Dave's leadership, overlaid with the national strategy for the Arctic region. But there, as my friend Larry Hinsman says, there's a Venn diagram of effort going on here. And so if you take the 4 pillars of the national strategy for the Arctic region, you will see the Arctic Ocean or reference to it. You can't avoid the fact that we have an Arctic Ocean surrounded by land, and so much is driven off of what's happening with the Arctic Ocean. But if you look at the 4 pillars of the national strategy of security, climate change, sustainable economic development, and international cooperation, those threads, those themes, the work that's embedded in the national strategy, which now Dave will lead into an implementation plan, you can overlay that on the new goals and objectives report released by the Arctic Research Commission that I have the honor of chairing, where we're looking at the Arctic Ocean and surrounding areas through a lens not of 4 pillars, but of 5 goals. And those 5 goals are environmental risks and hazards. So there's thematic overlay. Community health and well-being overlay. Infrastructure. Arctic economic research, whether it's blue ocean economy, some call it making a living, whether it's blue ocean economy or thinking about how communities can change or at least transition from economies that they have relied solely on to blend their economies. And finally, in all of our work, research cooperation, how central research is. Many of you know that I've been talking about research security. We talk about economic security and food security and civil security and hard security, the whole portfolio of securities. To me, research security should be discussed. And by that I mean, do we have the right researchers informing the work that needs to get done so we have sound policy coming out of sound research? Do we have the right funding going to the right agencies, whether it's within the federal government of the United States or with our partners abroad? Are we leveraging our collective interests and are we leveraging our collective expertise with our allies and partners and others who have a vested interest in the North? Are we thinking beyond northern borders to our colleagues in Asia or in Europe? How are we leveraging all that? This idea of research security, because I don't know how we address the governing issues, the many challenges we have without robust research investment informed by great leadership. And so I use the NSAR, the AESC, all of these acronyms, the Arctic Research Commission, IARPIC that Dr. Hinsman leads. You know, we all have strategies and plans, but how are we overlapping and how are we networking all of those? It's a question that I think we're doing a far better job in the last 1.5 to 2 years than we have in the past, not because good people haven't tried, because they have. And if it was easy, they would have done it already. But at least what I'm seeing here, Evan, is that there are these 3 C's in Mike's brain, this continuation of U.S. efforts in the region. There's a continuation of the effort. This head stops and starts, and we've tried. The fact, Representative Pingree, that you're here and you're not from the state of Alaska is a great thing, because it can't be one state. And Jane, it can't be one agency. It has to be the collectiveness of us all to address this biggest threat of all, climate, this giant existential threat to us all. The next one would be continuum of effort. So we mentioned the number of different agencies and efforts. There's a continuum here, from DoD strategies all the way through an Arctic Research Commission and its set of strategies. And I think, Jane, what you described is a continuity of effort. All of us trying to advance the work without duplication, but reinforcing the work that's being done. You know, and you've each covered other things I was going to go through some Research Commission goals. I won't do that, Evan, in the interest of time. But what I would say is that discussions, whether it's the Arctic Ocean or the Arctic writ large, what I'm seeing in the federal government with all our friends and colleagues who are working on this issue for decades are those 3 C's in my brain. And the fact that we're actually moving forward and that leadership in our country sees the Arctic through a very different lens, and it's not all security, although that usually catches the headline. Environmental change and climate change and the impacts capture the headline. That's good, but there's so many layers that we have to address in the Arctic Ocean, whether it's the Central Arctic Ocean's Fisheries Agreement and to ensure that we have the resources to actually do the good work that needs to get done to inform what may or may not happen in the future, to the very communities that are struggling with the changes and they happen to live along the shores of the Arctic Ocean. These are complex issues that can't be solved by one nation or one state. It has to be an integrated approach. I would just leave it there.
Mike, thank you so much. So, Representative Pingree, some thoughts on this?
I don't know, I think you've probably heard enough from me, but the only thing I would say, I just want to thank you so much for both of your presentations, and I do feel really privileged to be a part of this today and to be participating in this conversation and how we move forward. And I'm very grateful for this administration's attention to it. The fact that I think, as you said, the sense of urgency has really moved a lot of this policy work and understanding much faster in the last year or two. And of course, an international crisis does bring everybody's thoughts to bear. And between the security issues and the climate change issues, this is really a central focus. My interest will be how we move forward in making sure that more members of Congress are participants in these conversations, and what does it take. Again, not everybody is going to come from Maine or Alaska or even think, with all the things every member has on his plate, that this is going to be a big concern. But since I serve on the Appropriations Committee, there's always that question of how do you make sure we're getting enough funding in all of these areas, in the scientific research and the, and the strategic concerns, and the Coast Guard building the, or whoever decides to build the, the challenges there, and then the, sort of future questions that we bring up. So I think for me, one of the questions is how do you engage more members? How do you make sure it becomes part of, you said it, I appreciate that sentiment that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, and that is truly about climate change and security and everything else. And since I feel as if I'm one of the states that gets impacted first, I want to make sure that everybody sees it in exactly the same way. So I'm mostly interested in how we continue to work on strategies that engage more members, and understanding that this is not a parochial issue to those who live close. This is a serious international issue that could have great impacts to our country, and that we have to keep taking a leadership role.
So thank you all very much indeed. There are a lot of really interesting strands that we could follow up on here, although not all that much time to do so. So all of you have focused on the importance of the Arctic Ocean to U.S. policy. So in the time remaining to us, just a couple of questions to each of you. One is if you could focus a bit on the impacts of the Ukraine crisis on the fulfillment of U.S. policy goals. I think that would be of interest to this audience. And also, what can be done for the U.S. to work more with U.S. allies, Arctic states, non-Arctic states, in the context of the Arctic Ocean. So maybe begin again with Dr. Lubchenco.
Sure. I think we've touched on many of the challenges that exist, and you're absolutely right that the partnerships with both other Arctic Council members as well as other countries who might be doing research in the Arctic is really important. And I think those partnerships are what we are pursuing, both from the standpoint of research opportunities, but also other policy-relevant opportunities. One example that I would offer is that the U.S. and Canada are actively exploring joint efforts that might be appropriate for the Beaufort Sea, and just strengthening those partnerships. Comparing notes more closely on what each of us is doing, what we might do together, how can we be working together and do more than just what each of us could do individually. So that's a very specific example. And in the absence of the opportunity to move aggressively ahead with some of the programs that are now not possible because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, looking for those multilateral, other opportunities is really where we are focused. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Mike?
A couple things. One is the Commission has asked the research community and the policymakers in our country to redouble our efforts to survey and map its Arctic. It's poorly mapped. I don't need to go into the details, but I don't know how you advance economies in the north without understanding better the Arctic Ocean and the coastline of the state of Alaska. I don't know how you advanced our national security, the homeland security, inform our research on fisheries and ocean acidification without a far more robust, it costs a lot of money, I understand, and it's time and effort. But to me, one of the clarion calls must be to better survey and map our own Arctic Ocean areas. It just simply costs a lot of money, it's a lot of time, but its time has come. I think that's one area. The second one I want to point out is, to follow up on Dr. Luchenko's note, is that to me there seems, and our friends from Norway will hopefully advance this in the next panel, there seems an affinity here between the North American Arctic, Alaska, U.S., Canada, Greenland. You can take that arc right into Iceland and Norway, Sweden, Finland, but there is an arc of commonality there. And so if you leverage those relationships, if you leverage just that's already there in terms of research capacity, economic capacity, and other capacities, and look at ways to better integrate efforts across the North American Arctic with Nordic countries, this seems to me to be something there in terms of the Arctic Ocean that we can leverage better in the future.
Thank you so much. Representative Pingree, any thoughts?
Well, two things I would say. I mean, you mentioned the situation in Ukraine, and we all know how devastating that's been, but the result of it has been bringing together countries in ways that we've never worked together before, and I think that's a really important, again, also an awareness for members of Congress, for the, huge concerns raised by Russian dominance anywhere, so I think that is, in its own way, a helpful shift in our thinking. And so using that with the other countries who are so much more closely aligned with us now than perhaps we had been previously, and also the understanding that that's brought about security issues, about renewable energy and the importance of sort of understanding that role and how that role will be played out in the Arctic. And then somewhat of an unrelated point, but I didn't mention earlier, I've been struck by, every time I listen to anything that comes from the Arctic convenings or a panel or anything, there's always this sense, particularly from indigenous communities, particularly in Alaska, where we're going to have huge challenges of having to move and relocate communities, but also the sense of desperation, concern, frustration, indigenous peoples and youth, suicide rates, and a whole variety of other things that I think we also have to continue to incorporate, and it's in everyone's, remarks and everyone's thinking, but how do we really get down to the scale of individual communities and assisting in both, the movements that have to happen, the economic changes, the, psychological challenges that are going on, and while that doesn't always, fit neatly into a big scientific strategy, I'm always struck by how important that is, and how vital that is. It's easy to engage sometimes at a congressional level about more defense spending, and that's always the best hook of anything, is to say, there's going to be Russian and Chinese dominance there, and we have to deal with, whether it's shipping or whether it's security, but bringing it back down to that level of really how do we support those communities, and that's true in our own communities, but also I think something we share with other countries.
Evan,
Thank you so much.
could I tee
Please.
off that just
course.
very briefly? I really want to pick up on what you said, Congresswoman, because, and give you a very specific example of one of the ways that we're thinking about that. Mike mentioned IARPIC, which Dr. Barry Hinsman in the audience here, for which he's the executive director. So this is the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. In a few months ago, the IARPIC team released its new decadal, or is it decadal, Larry? No, 4-year strategic plan. 4-year?
The implementation is 2 years.
Yeah, but the strategic plan is 5 years. Okay, so the IARPIC strategic plan, 5-year strategic plan, and for the first time ever, it is very people-focused. It's focused on the people of the region and what is the research agenda that is needed to really get at some of these very serious challenges that are coupled social, environmental, economic, integrated challenges. And so I think we're seeing a new realization on the part of the research community about the importance of relevance of the work that they are doing. and in training all the biogeophysical, socioeconomic information, bringing all that to bear on how does this matter for the people of the region. And I think it's a real milestone report for that reason. And all the researchers that came together, it was a very consultative process. It wasn't just scientists sitting around, what do we want to do, but working with the communities. What do you need? What are the problems? How can we be helpful? And I think that's a real important step forward that we are seeing.
So thank you all very much. There's so much more that could be said, but we've in fact run out of time. So thank you all. Ending on a focus on the people of the region is just the right place to end. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our first panel. Thank you, Evan, for excellent moderation. Thank you, Congresswoman Pingree, Dr. Lubchenco, Dr. Sfraga. I'd like to welcome our second panel to the stage now. We will have Ambassador David Bolton as our moderator. As mentioned earlier, he's Executive Director of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. I should note he's a former senior fellow here at the Wilson Center. We're also lucky to have Dr. Jan Gunnar Winther, who is Director of Center for the Ocean and the Arctic, and Dr. Larry Hinsman, who is Associate Director of Polar Sciences in the Office of Science and Technology Policy and Executive Director of the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. And joining us remotely, we have Dr. Antje Boetjes, who is Director of the Alfred Wegener Institute and Professor at the University of Bremen at the Max Planck Institute for Marine Microbiology, my apologies. And I believe we have a live connection with Dr. Boetjes. So please, panel 2. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, hello.
Well, thanks very much, Rebecca. Let me thank the Wilson Center and the Norway's Center for the Ocean and the Arctic. Ambassador Krutnes, very nice to see you again. Let me say hello to distinguished panelists, including Dr. Boetjes online. My name is David Bolton. As you heard, this is a panel about science, and in particular about how scientists who are working in the Arctic, who care about the Arctic, have to face some new circumstances. And I would say there are really two sets of new circumstances confronting us today, both from policy, but for purposes of our panel, a scientific perspective. And one is that the climate crisis has accelerated. It is accelerating. From the time I started working on these issues to now, the rate at which the climate is warming relative to the rest of the planet has only accelerated. And the second challenge, of course, has to do with the difficulty of international cooperation that we already heard about from Ambassador Krutnes and others have referenced. In the past, it was possible to work with Russia. Indeed, a lot of the international architecture, a lot of the progress on science that has been done in the Arctic in the past has been done in cooperation with Russia. Now, that's a real problem. Here to explore these questions further, we have our three panelists. They've already been introduced, so I won't bother to do that again. We thought we would offer Dr. Winther a first crack at this, given that his center is our co-host. Doctor.
Thank you. Ambassadors and former president, and thank you to the Wilson Center for co-organizing this with the Center for the Ocean and the Arctic. Just a minute about the Center for the Ocean and the Arctic. It's 5 years old, and it's a governmental institution that was set down to assess knowledge on oceans and sustainable development. And we are giving advice to the businesses in Norway and also the government on how to sustainable develop ocean businesses in the Arctic. So that's us. We are funded and mandated by the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Fisheries, and we are located at the University in Tromsø. Okay, so climate change. I'm living in the Arctic in Tromsø, northern Norway. And climate change is actually happening every day, and that's felt by the people. We don't have any questions anymore, rarely, about this is actually a real thing. So we live in a way in a hotspot, in the Arctic hotspot, because the areas in the Barents Sea and further north are where the action really takes place. In very snowy Tromsø, my hometown, we had almost no snow in February this year. It was almost a record. And we have migrating species. Fishermen are worried about the situation, and so on and so on. So the climate change situation is very much felt. It feels real, and it's taken seriously. But if you look at climate change in isolation in that part of the Arctic, you will have many benefits, not at least in ocean resources. We have an increase in marine production, and that is isolated a advantage, for example, for fisheries, aquaculture, and so on. Now, to the second point you made, we have a different situation now, of course, and we have no collaboration on an institutional level with Russian colleagues anymore. It's on individual basis, but not on the institutional one. And of course, that's a great limitation, and the lack of knowledge on climate change, monitoring data, results from Russian colleagues is in the long term very disturbing scenario. Now, Norway had and have experience from the Cold War, and this is now a hot war, I know that very well, that relations within science was very useful for science, but also for more than science. And all wars will end one day, so there are many academicians in Norway discussing how we can ensure that we are in a position the day we have something that is not hot anymore, but colder or cold, to be entering again collaboration, for example, within climate change, because these are very much connected. Meanwhile, we see that we need to step up, because climate change is by no means taking a pause, rather the opposite. We see Nordic collaboration becoming more prominent. We know Sweden and Finland most likely will enter NATO, so there is a military collaboration, but also in the civil sector. We have made steps to increase the collaboration, and I think it's very natural, as Mike pointed out, to look to North America, Canada, and US, of course, in collaboration. So we need to step up, because climate change is just picking up. We have Russia out of the equation when it comes to collaboration, which is very unfortunate, extremely seen from a scientific point of view. And we have to double up and step up even more. And that's the situation I see.
Thank you very much, Dr. Winther. Now I'd like to offer the floor to Dr. Burgess, who is joining us remotely. Can you hear us? And please go ahead.
Yes, I hear you very well. Hello to everyone. I wish I could be with you, but I'm contacting you here from Berlin. Thank you for inviting me to say a few words and introduce to you also the Alfred Wegener Institute, Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research, Germany's Polar Research Institute. We receive governmental long-term funding. We operate large-scale infrastructure to do research, basic research, mostly in the Arctic. Our task is to look at both poles, Arctic and Antarctic, and our coasts, and of course the profile areas, climate, biodiversity, environmental pollution, policy advice is right in the middle of what you have commented. And so for the Arctic cooperation, we are basically coming from a phase of fantastic cooperation that culminated in the successful Mosaic mission, where our ship Polarstern, that you see here in the back, was frozen in and was open, was a platform, a home to so many different nations, so many different young people and young people that came of age, as ourselves here in the room. And so then came the shock that you have referred to, and the understanding that in a way we have trusted and relied on a type of open access and best scientific practice cooperation where no one could foresee to the last minute that this may just fall apart. And that is very, very worrisome. The point that I would like to make here is that we have learned nonetheless from these decades of fruitful cooperation some key points that are relevant and that remain relevant. So the access to those places that are basically the hotspots of climate change and biodiversity change, which are the polar regions, that is so incredibly important that we all can share the rare and expensive infrastructure that we have to access to tap into the Arctic Ocean and the extreme regions, so beyond the sea ice covered ocean. Let me remind you of the current important international collaboration of the ice sheets on Greenland, the hunt to understand the enigmatic ice streams of Greenland, the question, when did the Arctic freeze and when did it thaw, under what circumstances of the Earth system, with how much CO2 it is actually melting away, when is the tipping point, how close is it? This we all do in international collaboration. We have learned how to invest together into the important infrastructure, and I'm so grateful to the US that we also with Germany were able now to reinvest and to say we drive forward the GRACE mission that is essential in understanding water and ice on Earth. And also Germany will build a new polar station 2 that is also super important for that international collaboration. We are doing together really amazing work in those areas where one sometimes doubts that human can actually live and where one is always surprised for the extreme biodiversity, the unknowns that we find. Let me remind you that in international collaboration in the past few years, we were able to better understand volcanism, the role of Gackelridge in shaping not only the Arctic basin, but also an immense biodiversity of the most absurd beings. I just mentioned giant, old crawling sponges that inhabit the Arctic. I can mention cold water corals that live very close to the North Pole we had no idea about a few years ago. So we have so many examples of this great collaboration, and now we have to face the question that you have posed: can we continue, and do we have to continue without Russia? What does it actually mean? I would like to bring forward here that the cooperation with Russia has gone far beyond just the sharing of infrastructure, that we had irreplaceable scientific collaborations like the Biodiversity Taxonomy Network, and that we all should be aware and very honest about the situation that, of course, we all stand together, saying that nothing can progress as usual. We all have to take a step back and understand that under these circumstances, institutional cooperation does not work and has to pause. And that's what Germany decided, and that's what Europe and we all have decided. However, we also look at the next generation of people, the ones that will be there when things go for the better eventually. And so I'm looking forward to this panel to discussing a bit more what tools do we have to build tunnels, to build possibilities, to invest in the next generation of international collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wesches. Dr. Hinsman, floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. So it's a great honor to be here today. So Ambassador Kutnis and President Grimson and dear colleagues, it's really my pleasure to be here. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks to the Wilson Center. So I want to start my contribution to this conversation by thanking the Norwegian government and the Norwegian scientific community for the strong scientific partnerships and open collaborations that we've enjoyed going all the way back to the first International Polar Year in 1882 and 1883. So the United States is committed to international scientific collaboration and cooperation that flows from the mutual recognition of shared values, including scientific freedom, open science, transparency, honesty, equity, fair competition, objectivity, and democratic principles. And I'm also pleased to note that Norway and Germany also share these values. We greatly appreciate the strong partnerships that we have shared with our colleagues for such a long time, and particularly appreciate the collaborations that we've shared in polar oceanography and Arctic science and engineering. Both our nations, and indeed other nations as well, have benefited from our shared achievements in climatology, oceanography, marine biology, ecosystem-based management, and social science programs directed at life in northern regions. And on a personal note, I'm really pleased to remember my collaborations with Jan Gunnar on Svalbard many years ago when we were both young professors. However, Russia's unlawful and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine is an affront to the principles that we seek to affirm and our efforts to advance international science and technology and innovation. And until Russia ends its war against Ukraine, the United States government has limited our engagement with the Russian government in international projects and initiatives related to science and technology. Scientific cooperation in the Arctic remains as critical now as it has ever been. This region is undergoing fundamental changes, and the consequences of which we do not understand nearly well enough. And perhaps for these reasons, we must try to expand our scientific cooperation with others in Arctic as much as possible. There is still much we can do together. Our allies among the Arctic nations are collaborating in monitoring many critical environmental variables which are needed for assessing the rate of environmental change and verifying and validating climate models. We have collaborated with many nations to conduct field studies and cruises in the Arctic region, including, as Dr. Botius just mentioned, including the Mosaic expedition. Our Norwegian partners are also involved in currently leading the Synoptic Arctic Survey, which is documenting migration of marine species northward and enabling a good study of changes in marine ecosystems. We are also pleased to note that Norway is preparing to assume the chairmanship of the Arctic Council next May. 2 weeks ago, I was privileged to hear Morten Hogland, the new senior Arctic official for Norway, speak in a reception at the Norwegian Embassy in Japan. He spoke of Norway's enthusiasm to re-engage the Arctic Council with a focus on the people of the Arctic. These plans very nicely align with the new goals of the current Arctic Research Plan, as Dr. Lubchenco mentioned earlier today. And this places great emphasis on the people of the Arctic. Each of the goals in the U.S. Arctic Research Plan take a holistic approach to addressing the pressing needs of the Arctic peoples. These goals integrate important research on biological, physical, and social processes occurring in the Arctic. And by building collaborations across the various research disciplines and sectors of society, we are working to support sustainable, healthy, and resilient communities that are able to take on the changes and hazards that they are facing today. These collaborations also foster science to support people around the globe as we meet the climate crises. The importance of international scientific cooperation is emphasized throughout the U.S. Arctic Research Plan. International collaborations are crucial for accomplishing these goals of this plan. So in conclusion, I'll note that the complex societal challenges must be approached through more integrated research designs and be co-produced with and led by the indigenous communities and organizations. Collaborations among international researchers, programs, communities, including indigenous peoples, are more likely to result in comprehensive teams needed to develop the robust solutions required by Arctic societies. So thank you.
Thanks very much to all of you. So to start the discussion, I'd like to pick up on something that Jan Gunnar mentioned along the way. He said that all wars ultimately come to an end. And if I understood you correctly, you also said that we need to be ready to resume collaboration with Russia at such time when it may be possible to do so. What does that look like in practice? What ought we be doing now? What are we doing now to prepare for the moment when collaboration with Russia becomes possible again? That's actually a question I might throw out to all of you, but I'll start with you, Jan Gunnar. What steps can be taken now?
Well, this is a difficult question and a sensitive one, and of course science is not working in isolation from politics. But what I hear, to speak about what I hear from others, is in a way two schools here. Ones that are want to close down everything, and others that are seeking to find some kind of keeping relations open. And the former group may argue that we have topics that are outside the sanction regime in Europe. Some parts of Europe are importing, for example, fossil fuel. In Norway, there are three areas that are taken outside the sanction regime. The nuclear collaboration for very good and strong reasons, the search and rescue, and also the fishery cooperation in the Barents Sea.
So are you saying that science work on those topics with individual Russian scientists might, if not going on now, we might be looking ahead to resume that?
Well, what I'm saying is more or less explaining the current situation. There are areas where we are pragmatically collaborating with Russia, and there are areas where we are not. And climate change is such an area where we are not collaborating.
Right.
So an open question could be, is it possible to make sure that there is, at least at some level, probably very low level, relations and collaboration? Today it's on individual basis, which makes it very vulnerable because it's not systematically in any way, and there is no money along, no projects and so on. That's for the time being set on hold. But eventually, and hopefully, there must be a situation that is different from today's very complicated situation, and to make sure we are then able to restore relations with Russia, I think it's important to be keeping that in mind. One thing that bothers me, if I'll stop now, it's the preparation for the next International Polar Year. That's maybe we'll see the light in 33, so it's less than 10 years from now, and we need to prepare for that many years ahead. So in the current situation, it's really hard to see how you construct the next International Polar Year with not Russia on board. And that might be the impossible kind of challenge we have. But in a few years from now, we need, in a way, to enter the preparation phase. And then it becomes really important that we are preparing for, hopefully, a world that looks different from today, 10 years from now.
Thank you for that.
So no answers and only a big
questions.
Yeah, really, because it's so complicated. I don't see how I could give you a clear answer on this.
Dr. Bocius, Dr. Hinsman, do you have things you'd like to add on this point? How could we prepare now for a better future?
Yes, I think I mentioned it already quickly briefly in the statement that, of course, we have completely ended, we as now Germany, but also that's the same for Europe, ended all institutional collaborations. There are no large-scale projects running. There is no further funding in any of them. We have stopped, for example, the University of the Arctic collaboration between universities all around that had a lot of Russian universities included. So a lot of this is frozen. At the same time, we have all agreed that the peer-to-peer collaboration, where individual scientists publish the data they have obtained, that this, as long as it's possible, is supported. There were huge discussions amongst the journals and referees and editors of journals. Should we also end that? Is that a sensible sanction to say no more publication of any Russian with a national institutional affiliation? And in the end, basically, the International Science Board for Best Practices has decided we cannot discriminate on the basis of an individual's nation. And so I think what this is all for is to say that we believe in the future, and the next generation, as hard as it may be to think about this even, must be able to resume scientific cooperation in all those areas and many more that we have just discussed. We are aware that there are a couple of tunnels, as we call them. In a way, there is meteorological cooperation going on. There is international space science, at least for the infrastructure part, still going on. And there has been a big debate in Germany, should there be such a tunnel for climate sciences? Is that at all possible? But as we can't collaborate on large-scale infrastructure questions anymore and not institutionally, basically it's all down to the support of individuals, many of which have fled. I would also like to bring that to your attention, and you know that as well. The US has received a lot of refugees from Russia and professors from Russia that want to continue their work. So we all have that. And to me, this is an investment in the next generation. We have to be prepared, as Jan Gunnar said, that we can, in such crises, that we can help the future generations of scientists. We don't have very much defined means how to do that, that it is very important to invest into the future.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hinz, did you want to add anything in that? Or
Yes.
has it already been covered?
No, I do have a couple of thoughts in that. I think it is, of course, very natural that we should long for the days of collaboration that we experienced in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and early 2000s with Russia, and that we had wonderful collaborative relationships, scientific collaborations. And I think back to the 70s when the research among our our scientist, with the Russian scientist, actually opened the doors and led the pathways for policy agreements and for collaborations. And that was a good period where science actually led the policy and led the international relations. And there was some really positive efforts that came out of that. But at the same time, to believe or to look forward to business as usual relationships at this point is problematic.
It's a problem of trust, right?
It is.
And how long does it take to rebuild that?
It is, exactly. And it even if the war ended tomorrow, there were some horrific activities that occurred, and it's going to take time to rebuild that trust, and that's a problem that we will be dealing with for a long time. I don't know. I guess I do look forward to the day when we have good international relations, again, really driving the science forward. At this point, we do have good scientific collaborations going amongst our allies, and we are still doing good work in the Arctic science. And I'm hopeful that the Russian researchers are also continuing to make their observations, to do their work, and that sometime in the future we can again begin our synthesis studies and pull all this together. But at this point in time, that's a problematic issue to rebuild.
Thank you. Jan-Gunnar, you want to
Yeah.
add something to this?
Yeah, I agree with Larry. It's we are not in a position that we can have such collaboration today, obviously. But it was mentioned that by Antje that many Russians have left their country, and they are in different countries around the world with a lot of expertise and knowledge on Arctic issues as well. So that group is an important resource that you could make use of in these times where we can't really collaborate with Russians in Russia. So that's one point. And back to what was said here by several people, we have to step up more than we usually would have had in a normal situation, and collaboration across the Atlantic between North America and Nordic countries, I think is really something that we should make sure that we take the best out of in this time, while we are hopefully seeing a different situation sometime into future. But I'm as Larry, I'm not optimistic that will be in the near future.
No time soon. So if I can ask a related question, one of the serious problems I know the scientists are facing is that the data from the Russian portion of the Arctic is now much harder to get. If it ever was easy to get, it certainly has become even harder to get. Are there ways to make up for or to overcome the new and challenging problems of data from from a scientific perspective relating to the Russian Arctic? Are there things we can be doing to make up for the situation? Yes, go ahead, Dr. Pochus.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, I'm leading the North Pole expedition with Polarstern, an international collaboration effort this year, where I go 2 months with Polarstern, and normally, under normal circumstances, I would have completed our 10-year effort. Every 10 years we go and look for the distribution of seafloor communities and their response to sea ice change in the Siberian margin. So, of course, this is not off limits. But it is not possible to replace these kinds of studies by any remote sensing. However, remote sensing in these times has become the ultimate tool to continue with some of the important problems that we have to observe in the Pan-Arctic fashion to understand what is happening. There was an initiative that we had together with various, even Russian industry, that the thawing permafrost is a great danger to pipelines, to tanks of oil, and to all kinds of infrastructure, to the villages. If you look into these publications of how fast permafrost is destroying roads and is a threat to communities, of course you know that, but in Siberia it's extreme. The forest fires, the tundra fires, so there is so much going on because there are heat waves one year after the other where we have to learn, have to continue learning. And so an improved remote sensing program, and for us who can collaborate, is to me really a key thing that we have to organize for the future.
Okay, other thoughts? Yes?
Absolutely. So in some respects, the lack of data from the Russian Arctic is pushing us in the direction we need to go anyway. In that, in Arctic science, we really need to move into the realm of having synthesis and system models that can pull all of these components together so we can understand how the change in one component will affect the other components of the Arctic system. And so this lack of data is actually forcing us to further refine those system models, and also the, as Antio was suggesting, the remote sensing capabilities. And so that does help us a lot, and it does move us forward. At the same time, there are many disciplines where we can't do that, and particularly with respect to social science issues and the effect on communities, particularly in the Russian Arctic. But and further, there is great concern. We do a relatively good job of monitoring the emissions from anthropogenic sources. We do a terrible job in monitoring and assessing the fluxes of carbon dioxide and methane from permafrost and from wildfires. And with the Russian Arctic making up such a huge proportion of the Arctic, and that information is totally lacking, that's a big issue. That's problematic, and that is something we can try to fill in with modeling. We can try and fill it in with remote sensing, but we still need that ground truth data to verify and validate these models.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I just could add that I share this perspective of Larry, that this speeds up things we had to do anyway, and you could add that sensor technology, machine learning, AI, and so on will also be part of the future, let's say, monitoring and studies of the Arctic.
Okay. Well, I think we have time for one more.
I have one more aspect, if I
Go
can
ahead.
quickly drop that. So you might all know or not that the Arctic seafloor is terribly undermapped. Much of the map we have is inspired, was inspired by Marie Tharp, one of the greatest geophysicists of her time, but then by submersibles that had no GPS. So where we do collaborate, but basically loosely, just with a handshake, is between Norway, Germany, and the US, and a little bit sometimes France. We have a fantastic project to map Gackel Ridge and map the ridges and the seafloor, understand how many seamounts we have, and look into the question of what is there and what could be, now with the new agreement on the high seas, what could be for the Arctic, the marine protected areas in the high sea. And we cannot wait to organize this any longer. And I think if we map these areas of immediate urgency for better collaboration and just work together more, even that is perceived by many scientists and by the young generation as a sign for hope and as a sign for readiness also for better international collaboration. So rather than only be sad and regret, it is fantastic to think about the things we can do together nonetheless, and that we should do together. So I'm really hopeful that with these loose corporations where we're not jointly funded, but everyone brings their national funding in and we do it, that we do not forget that the Arctic seabed, the Arctic ocean itself is like terribly understudied, and anything we do together is better than waiting.
Okay. Well, as Dr. Bush says, the world does have a new tool at its disposal. Just a few weeks ago in New York, there was completed negotiations on the so-called BB&J agreement, the agreement about marine areas beyond biodiversity in marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. And yes, there are such areas in the Arctic, and it may come to pass someday, once the agreement enters into force, that it can be used as a tool for better governing the region. We only have a minute, so maybe just a quick question. I'm going to actually ask you, Jan Gunnar, since you're the one who raised it. Yes, there is a new International Polar Year coming about a decade from now, but the preparations for which need to start fairly soon. What if circumstances vis-a-vis Russia are not appreciably different over the course of the next decade? Can IPY move forward under such circumstances, in your judgment?
My judgment is, very briefly, that it's better with an International Polar Year without Russia than not an International Polar Year. But I think Larry is in a much better position to actually formally answer that, because he's in the midst of the processes that work with that. So I'll leave it to him to have the final.
Can we have an IPY without Russia?
Actually, I was very glad that you asked Jan Gunnar that. So it is very problematic. Russia obviously occupies more than half the Arctic, and not just in space, but also in economy and in people. And so it will be very difficult if we don't have an international
And it's a major play in Antarctica as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. So a challenge. Dr. Boches, any thoughts about IPY?
Well, we have many challenges that we need to progress with. In the UN decade, we have the IPY idea. There are big ideas for Antarctic, but joint missions. And in my opinion, we have principles like we had to come really, unfortunately, to G7, G20. We have various ways of demonstrating that if we cannot do it internationally, all inclusive, we must go on and collaborate. So I'm all for collaborating even stronger. And even if it's sour, it feels sour, we must go on.
Okay. I'd ask all of you to join me in thanking the panelists for their contributions. It's been a pleasure being with you today. Thanks again to the Wilson Center and the Center for the Ocean and the Arctic.